Just sentence him, and let's move on, the young prosecutor snapped, rolling his eyes as the frail veteran was led into the courtroom in shackles, his coat torn, face bruised, and dignity barely intact. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply sat at the defense table, head bowed, no lawyer by his side, only silence and shame. And then, without warning, the courtroom doors swung open. A man in full military uniform marched in, medals glinting under the lights, boots striking the floor like thunder. He didn't pause, didn't ask permission. He walked straight to the old man, sat beside him, and said with calm authority, "You don't know who you're sentencing. Before we continue, hit subscribe, and if you believe true heroes deserve respect, comment, 'I stand with veterans.'" On a gray and rainy Monday morning, the kind that seemed to soak into your bones and whisper that something important was about to happen. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 3 creaked open as an old man named Henry Wallace shuffled in slowly, his footsteps echoing through the polished marble hall like quiet thunder. A worn beige coat draped over his thin frame, hands trembling slightly as he clutched a small manila envelope to his chest. The only thing he carried besides the invisible weight of years filled with battle scars and betrayal. And as he took a seat at the defendant's table, his eyes scanned the empty seat beside him. No lawyer, no advocate, just a battered war veteran facing charges he didn't fully understand, accused of property damage, trespassing, and defamation after he tried to stop a corrupt real estate developer from demolishing the home he and his late wife had built with their bare hands 5 decades ago. A home filled with photos, memories, laughter, and promises, now marked for destruction to make room for luxury condos he could never afford. And as the bailiff announced the judge's arrival, Henry stood with quiet dignity, even though his knees ached and his back screamed in protest. Because some habits never die. Once a soldier, always a soldier. And when the prosecutor, a young man in a crisp navy blue suit with too much gel in his hair and ambition in his eyes, rose to his feet, he glanced at Henry with thinly veiled contempt, already assuming victory, because what threat could an old man with no legal training pose in a room like this, especially when the system was designed to crush men like him, those who spoke plainly and carried truth like a badge of honor. And as the opening arguments began, the prosecutor painted Henry as a dangerous squatter, an unstable old man clinging to the past, using words like delusional, erratic, and volatile to describe a man who had served 3 tours in Vietnam, rescued comrades under fire, and buried friends without fanfare or complaint. A man who now sat silently, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes staring not at the floor, but into some distant battlefield only he could see. And behind him, in the gallery, reporters whispered, scribbling notes for their evening articles, and townspeople watched, some frowning in sympathy, others shaking their heads at what they believed was just another sad story of an old man who refused to let go. But none of them knew the truth, not until the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, not with chaos, but with the calm certainty of boots walking with purpose. and in stepped a man in full military uniform, tall, imposing. Every ribbon on his chest earned, not bought. Every medal speaking to missions whispered about in Pentagon corridors. And as he walked down the aisle, his shoes clicking like a metronome of justice, the air shifted, people turned, whispers froze, and even the judge paused mid-sentence, eyebrows raised. Because this was not just anyone. This was Colonel James McAllister, active duty, highly decorated, known across branches for his leadership, his ethics, and his unshakable loyalty to his men. And without breaking stride, the colonel walked straight to Henry's table, pulled out the empty chair beside him, and sat down, nodding once at his old friend, who looked at him with a flicker of recognition, then a faint smile, the kind only shared between men who've seen death together and lived to tell no one about it. And when the judge asked him to explain himself, the colonel stood and said calmly, "I'm here to represent my brother in arms, not legally, but morally. And if this courtroom has any sense left, you'll hear the truth before you pass judgment." And what followed was nothing short of a transformation, as the room that once viewed Henry as a relic now began to see him through the colonel's eyes, as a man who had saved over 40 lives in a single night in Da Nang, carrying wounded men on his back through enemy fire. A man who declined medals and interviews and chose instead to live quietly with his wife Margaret, teaching at the local school, planting a garden, helping neighbors fix broken fences, until the developer arrived, a man named Calvin Brooks, who waived fake documents and bribed the town council to rezone the area, threatening seniors and low-income families. And when Henry protested, when he stood on his porch holding a photo of his wife and said, "You'll have to take me down before you take my home," they laughed. And when he stayed after they bulldozed the houses next door, they had him arrested, smeared his name, and labeled him a lunatic. But now, with the colonel presenting letters from former generals, testimonies from neighbors, aerial maps showing illegal permits, and a recording Henry had made of the developer admitting he'd take the old Coots place down by any means necessary, the courtroom shifted like tectonic plates cracking open the truth. And by midday, the prosecutor's hands shook as he tried to object. But every time he rose, James met his eyes, and the silence said everything. You don't mess with soldiers who still know how to fight. And by the time Henry was asked to speak, his voice, though gravelly, held a steadiness that silenced even the reporters, as he looked at the jury and said, "I didn't fight for this country to be pushed out by the same kind of tyranny I once faced overseas. I stood for something then, and I'm standing for it now." And when the judge recessed for deliberation, the tension in the room felt like a live wire, snapping with anticipation, and 37 minutes later, the verdict came, not guilty on all counts. And furthermore, the judge ordered an investigation into the developer's company, freezing the demolition, restoring Henry's rights to the property, and recommending full restitution. And as Henry stood there stunned, the colonel extended a hand and said, "Told you I'd come if you ever needed backup." And the two men walked out together, not with fanfare, but with the quiet grace of those who've carried heavy loads for far too long. And outside the courthouse, the skies finally cleared, and reporters swarmed. But Henry simply raised his hand and said, "All I ever wanted was my home." And the photo that went viral that day wasn't of the courtroom, or the verdict, or even the colonel's medals. It was of an old man and a soldier walking side by side, past the cameras, toward a beat-up pickup truck with a flag bumper sticker and a cracked windshield. But to them it was more than enough. And in the weeks that followed, the developer was indicted. The town council was audited, and Henry's story made national headlines not because he was a hero in war, but because he stood his ground when no one else would. And soon veterans from all over the country sent letters, flowers, flags, even offers to help restore his home. And on the day the town officially recognized his property as a historic site, a choir of school children sang the anthem Henry once hummed to himself while patching his roof, and James stood beside him, hand on shoulder, while the mayor, the same one who once avoided Henry's calls, handed him a golden key to the city. But Henry just smiled and handed it to a little boy nearby and said, "It belongs to all of us," because that's who he was, a man who never asked for glory, but whose story became a symbol of resistance, of brotherhood, of the quiet courage that lives in those who refuse to be erased. And long after the headlines faded and the news trucks left, Henry and James could be found on that same porch, sipping black coffee, watching the sun rise over the trees. Two old soldiers who'd once again proven that even in a world filled with noise, truth still has a voice, and it speaks loudest when it walks into a courtroom not with a suit, but with a uniform and a promise. "I've got your six."